Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you today and those who are joining online to this seminar hosted by the International Inequalities Institute at the LSE. My name is Shalini and I'm an anthropologist and an assistant professorial research fellow here at the III. I'm incredibly pleased to be chairing today's seminar titled Aid and the Transnational Extraction of Care. Today's speaker is Dinah Hannaford, an associate professor at the Department of Comparative Cultural Studies at the University of Houston. Dinah is a fellow anthropologist, and it is a great pleasure to have her here today at the III to discuss her monograph, Aid and the Help, International Development and the Transnational Extraction of Care, just recently published by Stanford University Press 2023 as part of the series Globalization in Everyday Life. I'm going to circulate Dinah's book as long as it comes back to me. As you can see, I've thoroughly enjoyed it and it's full of underlines and purple highlights. So I'm going to start by just circulating it. This is not Dinah's first book. She's really an accomplished anthropologist. Her first book was called Marriage Without Borders. And just recently, a very interesting second book has come out with Rutgers University Press, co-edited, called Opting Out. Lovely title. So overall, Dinah's work centers on the political economy of intimate life and the inequalities that she documents so beautifully. She's a very experienced ethnographer. So I'm going to hand you over to Dinah. And many thanks to all of you who are here today. Enjoy the event, continue having the sandwiches and the coffee, and over to you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here with you. Thank you, Shalini, for the invitation to discuss my most recent book with you, which came out just in April, so it's brand new, hot off the presses. And the book is an ethnographic study of the relationship between expatriate aid workers in Africa and their domestic employees. So hiring domestic workers is a routine part of the expat development lifestyle, whether working for a state aid agency like the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, or what used to be called DFID here, but now is part of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, I believe. Or working for an NGO like Oxfam, Save the Children, World Vision. Expatriate aid workers posted in the developing world employ maids, nannies, security guards, gardeners, and chauffeurs. And I wrote this book partly because though almost every expat aid worker in the so-called developing world has local people working within the intimate sphere of their homes, it's something that's never discussed academically about the aid industry and its praxis. And so ethnographers of development have been insisting for decades that policy is not made in the tiny spaces of expert offices, right? But is what it becomes what it is during implementation. And I contend that this includes the way that expat aid workers live, play, and solicit paid care while they're overseas. So my book addresses this omission through an ethnographic analysis of the intersection between development work and domestic work, drawing on multiple years of participant observation in Dakar, Senegal, over the past couple of decades, as well as 5 years of digital ethnography, which I can talk about more in the Q&A, in expat and aid workers online spaces, and a core of 36 interviews with both aid workers in Dakar in French and in English and Italian, and with domestic employees, which I conducted in French and Wolof. And then more informal interviews with other expats, with Senegalese who work in and around the development industry, and development workers who are now stationed back in their home countries. So like other employers of domestic workers, expat development workers as a class are dependent on the reproductive labor of a portion of the global lower classes for the reproduction of their own status. As I show in the book, aid workers' migration to the field and their employment of cheap domestic labor give them the means for increased status, financial well-being, and enhanced work and family balance. In this way, I classify them as economic migrants, although race and colonial legacy often prevents scholars, governments, and lay people from categorizing expatriates as economic migrants. in this manner, although I should note that Sarah Kuntz has a new book. She's at the University of Essex, and she has this wonderful new book that tracks the development of that category of expatriate that tries to bring it into the conversation of economic migration. But then we usually fail to include expats in the category of economic migrants, that there are so few studies of them, that organizations that track migration really closely, like the IOM, like the OECD, have very little meaningful data about their migration. That says a great deal about our understanding of whose mobility should be controlled and disciplined and who should be allowed unfettered access to mobility. So although much work on migration and domestic services about South-North migration, the migration of care workers themselves, the fact that the employers in this case are the international economic migrants and the employees are local citizens ultimately does little to upset the global social order and the employees, the global social order of the International Division of Reproductive Labor. So to use Marcel Brenius' term, the servants of globalization here are the same demographic, right? The Black and brown women of poorer countries. Arlie Hochschild has used the metaphor of extraction in her writing about the global care chain, drawing a parallel between the imperialist extraction of resources like gold and rubber and the current migration of care workers from the developing world to the West to do caring labor for low cost. I too deploy this metaphor in thinking about aid work. So spotlighting the outsourcing of cheap reproductive labor, the extraction of care, what I call the extraction of care, that occurs so regularly in the practice of international development work, is, I think, an invitation to identify the other multiple ways that the ostensibly giving industry of development is an extractive industry as well. So my studies focus on the care work of local people for expatriate workers, the rewards it brings for the expats and the sacrifices and ambivalent opportunities it entails on the part of domestic workers, flips the script on facile representations of Western aid workers coming to help. Right? Emphasizing instead the extracted labor of local people that upholds the international development industry. So today I just want to talk about one, in the interest of time, just talk about one aspect of this book, which is how aid workers themselves reckon with the contradictions between their understanding of their own position as altruists seeking to uplift the poor on the one hand, and then being bourgeois expats who profit from the cheap domestic labor of the poor on the other hand. So, to use the words of Ana Ramos Zayas, how these aid workers, quote, inhabit their privilege and strive to make ethical and moral sense of social and racial inequalities that are inherently immoral, unquote. So expat aid workers often have ambivalent feelings about the domestic workers and that they hire and the work that those workers perform. For European and American aid workers who employ domestic work, although they generally express relief and appreciation for the luxury of having house staff, they also feel embarrassment and guilt and discomfort about hiring people to do their domestic labor. So taking advantage of their relative wealth and privilege to outsource the low status work in their home and paying rates that are far below what they themselves would accept as a living wage in their own country, it doesn't fit with their perception of their purpose as aid workers in Africa. Though other forms of Western economic migration to Africa, including mining or private industry, produce and exploit the same domestic labor pool, there's no inherent paradox between their industry's raison d'etre and their impact. Aid workers, however, have devoted their careers to an industry whose stated aim is to improve well-being and increase prosperity around the globe. How can they reconcile this mission with the personal perks and wealth extraction they collect from the industry? How can they be at ease when their salaries are so far superior to those around them, including in their own industry, right? Local people employed by the development sector. How can they, when the opportunity to wash their dishes and empty their garbage appears advantageous to many around them, enjoying the fruits of the power and wealth disparities between their home nation and their host nation is potentially disturbing and distressing to aid workers and has to be reframed so as to keep consistent their self-image of being on the right side of global justice. The inequities of race and nation that fuel their career opportunities are not only all around them in their overseas posts, but are brought directly into the home through locally purchased domestic service. The home becomes a transnational contact zone where they can't escape the realities of wealth and opportunity gap between themselves and local people and the fact that they are capitalizing on those disparities. So aid workers, I found through my ethnographic work in Dakar, react in particular ways to deflect, to ease, and to subvert the discomfort of sitting in that privilege. In the book, I explore 3 such strategies, 2 of which I'll simply lay out, and the third I'll discuss today in more detail. The first is to recast their employment of domestic workers as a duty, as an obligation, akin to the white man's burden, right? To be a job creator and promote and provide income opportunities, however meager, for local people. As Jillian, the regional director for a faith-based INGO said, it's, quote, it's kind of this mixed thing. You feel like, especially in American culture, you know, I can do it all by myself. We're independent. We don't have people clean for us. But at the same time, it's also this, okay, it is actually a good opportunity. And that's where you do feel good about it. You're like, okay, well, I make a pretty good living and blah, blah, blah. So it's kind of a mixed thing. And so rather than sitting in the feelings of discomfort at outsourcing aspects of life maintenance that could ostensibly be done by oneself, Jillian and the others framed their role as one of job creators and then could, quote, feel good about it. So turning the purchase of cheap domestic labor into a kind of noblesse oblige is a deft way to face guilt and discomfort about privilege and the outsourcing of reproductive labor. Indeed, the narrative of an obligation to intervene for the good of the other is part of the depoliticization of poverty that characterizes the international development industry more broadly. And it goes without saying, of course, that the philosophy of the burden to help those less fortunate was and continues to be used as a justification for all sorts of imperial intervention, right? And exploitation as well. So the second strategy is to minimize discomfort and to make a concerted effort to be a good boss or a nice boss. This can mean striving for emotional closeness with domestic staff, or being low key and not demanding about the quality of work, or even going to great lengths of being to avoid firing people when they're unhappy with the quality of their work. It's something that came up a lot in interviews. By fixating on the details of being a nice person, aid workers are able to de-emphasize the power differential in their understandings of these relationships and to avoid acknowledging the ethical structural issues that shape their employment of local people to work in their homes. In other contexts, researchers have shown that employers of domestic workers deploy personalism as a way to reduce class boundaries and alleviate class guilt. So having friendly relations minimizes the social separation and allows the employer to imagine that the employee is an equal and not in a position of subordination. Aid workers I interviewed wanted their employees to walk a very particular line of being comfortable but not too comfortable in their homes. Several aid workers told me of firing maids, not because the cleaning wasn't done to their satisfaction, but because the maid didn't make chit chat or didn't seem relaxed enough in the home to minimize the social distance between employer and employee, thereby ruining the illusion of friendly equality that a more sociable relationship could help maintain. Yet I also heard stories of maids who had been fired for too much familiarity and comfort. One aid worker returned home to find his housekeeper entertaining her own guest in his home, which felt, quote, kind of like a violation. Another aid worker told of a colleague who saw her maid's Facebook page that the maid was wearing her hat and taking selfies. It was not like this was the hat just laying out, my interlocutor said with an air of scandal. It was something put away. Right, so these two cases display what my aid worker interlocutor saw as clear violations of the boundaries that domestic workers should respect, and boundaries that were doubtless never articulated to the domestic worker. And in both cases, the maid was fired. And this, what I'm describing here is really not new. Most of the feminist literature about care, feelings of care work, explore these broad issues of being close but not too close, right? This is very standard for that kind of literature. Whereas the condescension of care for the poor in the development industry is usually framed as paternalism, the condescension of care for domestic servants is cast as maternalism. Maternalism is characterized by an obfuscation of the economic relationship between domestic workers and their employers by portraying it as a familial relationship. And this is something, oh, she's like a daughter to me, or she's like another mother to the kids, right? These familial terms that come up. Employees are treated like members of the family selectively, and in ways that are usually controlled by the employer. In this context, in which the employers are also aid workers, there's a mix of both paternalistic ideas of development and maternalistic approaches to treating house staff. Scholars of domestic work are clear that even well-intentioned maternalism is a site of uneven power relations and can heighten the structural asymmetry of the employment relationship, weakening the employee's negotiating position in terms of wages and conditions. As any attempt to negotiate these would be kind of an insult to the family, right? You're not doing this for money, you're doing this because we love each other, right? That kind of is implied by that. So being part of the family in a conditional and contingent manner can make domestic workers more vulnerable rather than less vulnerable. The obfuscation of the employment relationship is entirely contingent. When employers wish to assert the lack of familial obligation they have with these non-familial house members, they have the power and authority to do so. And this came up in my work a lot. Expatriate development workers tend to be very itinerant, right? They stay in one post for a few years and then move on, right? So any familial relationship or obligation is cut off very quickly once they leave their post. Okay, so we moved on to the third way that expat aid workers deal with their ambivalent feelings and discomfort about employing household help, and that is to bring additional transactions into their relationship beyond paying directly for domestic services. So these include paying for additional training, supporting the workers' families financially, giving career and financial advice, and giving monetary and material gifts. Aid workers code these transactions as charitable, in ways that help them avoid thinking of this extra investment as compensation for what they know are extremely low wages. Instead, using care as an idiom for these gestures of financial support, it puts them in the position not as exploiter of cheap labor, but as benevolent patron or mentor. Thereby, the site of their exploitation of the labor reserve created by poverty can itself be reframed as their own efforts to develop or aid the poor. As a matter of course, the majority of aid workers I interviewed told me about some kind of help that they were offering to their domestic staff that was outside the fee-for-services employment relationship. When I asked if the domestic worker had children, I routinely got an answer similar to that of Alain, who worked for a French NGO fighting famine. He said, she does, so we help out. One of her kids is in France, so we pay for his tuition. From paying school fees for children to paying for literacy classes, cooking classes, and vocational training of various kinds, for the domestic worker, many aid workers were engaged in a project of improving the lives of their domestic workers. They vastly preferred this kind of engagement, giving money for a specific project, to direct handouts, which caused employers acute discomfort and concern for their own exploitation. This is something that came up in interviews all the time, is that direct solicitations for money made them very uncomfortable and suspicious of the intentions of their domestic workers. Expat aid workers routinely position themselves not just as the patron, the French for the boss, of their domestic workers, but as patron as well, contributing beneficently and on their own terms to the causes of the lives of their workers that spoke to them. Fiona, who worked for a large international religious charity, was preparing to leave Dakar when I met her, and she was contemplating what role she would play in the life of her house staff when she returned to Brussels. Throughout her time in Senegal, she had taken seriously the responsibility she felt she and her husband had as patrons, giving life and financial advice to her staff, as well as running a tight ship in the home to teach them about work ethic and responsibility. She told me she had played a guiding role in her nanny Florence's life in particular, providing advice and counsel as well as loans or monetary gifts towards certain expenses that Fiona believed were good investments. Fiona disapproved of Florence and her husband's choice to use their savings to buy a piece of land outside Dakar, where they could afford it. Fiona described this land as out in the middle of nowhere and thought it was an impractical choice given that there was no possibility of finding domestic work with expats in its peri-urban location. She opted against contributing to the purchase, telling me, we could have, but she and her husband did not help with the project because they thought it was so ill-considered. They did, however, want to continue investing in Florence's gifted daughter, who Fiona described as really bright, like really bright. Fiona expressed appreciative approval of Florence's commitment to finding the best schools for her children. Education is the big thing, she told me, because she sees our education, you know. Fiona believed that she and her husband had inspired Florence with how education had shaped their own lives, and she felt education was the best avenue for investing resources in Florence after they left. She brought up one of the programs of the large religious humanitarian organization she works for. We have child sponsorship programs. We have all sorts all over the world. So if it were within our means, then that's something I would consider. Fiona framed her desire to support Florence's efforts to advance her daughter's education as a parallel to her development agency's famous child sponsorship program. She put herself in the role of developer and her nanny in the role of target population or beneficiary. This is a distortion, or at least a very partial perception of what their relationship is based on, which is an employment relationship in which Florence provides salaried caring labor for Fiona's family. That Fiona saw her role in Florence's life as a benefactor and advisor gave Fiona the opportunity to feel even more power and esteem from her relationship with Florence, in addition to extracting her reproductive labor at a very low wage. Like Fiona, who took her development agency as a model for how to engage with her house staff, Tamara uses programming from her agency in relating to her first household employee as well. Tamara, an international NGO worker from the Balkans, said her housekeeper had been asking for loans, including just days after being paid her salary. For Tamara, this suggested not that the salary was far too low to cover her housekeeper's living expenses, but that the housekeeper needed Tamara to teach her how to manage money. I said, you need some financial service training. So I sat with her and I said, what are your bills? When are they due? When you get paid at the start of the month, maybe no one ever told you, you need to plan for your water bill, your electricity bill. Pay that first, set aside the rest. Tamara laughed, said, I was bringing in some of our programming work we do in the village to help her. Tamara described this effort to educate her employee as empowering her housekeeper. Nancy, an American in her early 50s who worked in sustainable agriculture, paid her house staff not according to the value of their man hours, but according to her own philosophy of responsible giving. For example, when disclosing that what she paid her housekeeper, of whom she said, I sort of see her like my daughter, she explained, what I do is I don't pay a really high salary. I pay 80,000. It's a small apartment, but then I give her money for other things. So roughly 105 pounds a month for 5 full days of work a week was certainly below the rate that most expats paid themselves, regardless of the size of the apartment. But Nancy preferred to give a low monthly salary and then say yes to various requests from her housekeeper that she felt were worthy, including covering medical bills for her housekeeper's daughter or paying for English language lessons and night school. Nancy was hesitant in explaining her reasonings for this choice to me. She said, I hate to say this, it sounds so un-PC, but when the Senegalese staff that I've had have a good sum of money, the majority of them are not responsible and don't know how to save money and can't save it. She recounted a story of her previous security guard, Abdu. She had given Abdu a substantial raise when she increased his duties to watering the garden and walking the dogs, and shortly thereafter he disappeared. She found out that he had taken this new influx of cash and used it to migrate to Southern Africa, leaving Nancy without a security guard. After that, she said, I realized that giving big lump sums of money to somebody doesn't create the most responsible behavior. Nancy backtracked a bit from the statement, giving instead a cultural argument rather than an individual one for her employees' behavior. She said, I shouldn't say irresponsible, I'm putting a judgment on it. The whole concept of being able to save money when you have someone in your family that is needy, that really needs something, you're required to help, and you can't just save it. It's considered irresponsible if you do that. Another cultural aspect. So they're unable to save money because there's always someone in the family who's going to need money. So for Nancy, it was the Senegalese population at large that could not be counted on to be responsible with their money. This attitude mirrors the way that aid dollars are often given not directly to governments, which are assumed to be full of corruption and self-interest, but funneled through NGOs, which are presumed to have only technocratic ideals and goals. Nancy's idea of how money should be used correctly to be saved, not invested in family or in personal networks or in economic migration, is here framed as not as culturally American, right, but as responsible. When aid workers feel that they are acting as developers, as donors, as beneficent guides for their domestic staff, improving their lives and investing in their future well-being, they are able to ignore or dilute some of the potentially troubling aspects of their position. Reframing outside gifts or guidance as charitable or even as a form of aid work allows aid workers to disavow the morally suspect or commercial in nature aspects of their relationship with domestic workers and preserve what has been called a delicate psychological equilibrium. They're not simply paying someone to clean their toilets and drive their children around. They are providing a livelihood, contributing to a family, building the capacities of those who they thereby consider under their care as much as the other way around. Monetary gifts and paying medical bills get rebranded not as supplementing what is a very low wage for hard work in an expensive city, but as gestures of charity and care that reflect well on the giver. Development work is often framed as a matter of care. Aid workers, as well as the world at large, usually see their contributions as caring for the world's poor, as providing help and aid, even aid itself. But care has never been a benignly positive or even value neutral force or instinct, right? The care itself can confirm or construct positions of superiority and inferiority, intentionally or unintentionally. And projects and regimes of caring often serve colonizing ends and perpetuate or cement inequalities. As Michelle Murphy puts it, the stratigraphies of care, intimate relations, and labor have long legacies that thread through the very operation of European colonialism and American slavery, segregation, and empire. The origins of development as an industry are firmly rooted in these entanglements between, again, care, intimate relationships, and labor. In the post-war period of African colonialism, there was a distinct turn to focus rhetorically on the good works of colonialism. This period, which is referred to as welfare colonialism or even as developmental colonialism, put a charitable face on imperialism, largely in response to the growing criticism of colonialism in the metropole and in the colonies in that period after the war, of the Second War. So a strategic rebranding focused on the benevolent projects of lifting people up, right, rather than on the realities of resource extraction and labor extraction, including military labor in the form of soldiers. In Africa and beyond, these humanitarian good works of empire were part of its very durable architecture. and flowed neatly into the post-independence pivot to development interventions in the same places by the same architects. So in focusing on the relationship between development work and domestic work, I'm similarly interested in the contemporary labor and resource extraction that a charitable face can obscure. My studies focus on the care work of local people for expatriate aid workers, emphasizes not what aid brings to its supposed beneficiaries, but instead the reproductive labor of local people that upholds the international development industry, and more broadly upholds the development industry's work to uphold the status quo of a profoundly uneven global distribution of labor, mobility, and consumption. So just as a conclusion, I want to note that it was especially European and American aid workers who felt really profound discomfort with having help in their home. Alma, for example, the country director of a faith-based NGO who grew up in Latin America, didn't feel the same awkwardness as her US counterparts. She said, I'm from a developing country and having house helpers is normal. It's not a new thing to me and I don't have any mixed feelings about it, seriously. As long as we pay a salary that is fair and cover, you know, the healthcare and everything, that's another job. Through those who came from post-colonies specifically, the very visible hierarchies of wealth that entitled professional people to hire poorer people to clean their homes were not something to be ashamed of or uncomfortable about, but merely a reality. Alain, the French NGO worker working against famine, said his non-Western expat colleagues were the ones who broke him of his idea of trying to not have domestic help. He said, I was talking to a friend of mine who grew up in Mumbai. She was like, I never understood the Western abhorrence of it because you're not really doing anything by avoiding it. Doing your own laundry does nothing to reverse colonial power relations. Western expat aid workers have, that's a great line, Western expat aid workers have ambivalent feelings about domestic staff. They feel obligated, they feel guilty. Having domestic help is awkward and frustrating and luxurious and essential all at once. They resent their help as much as they feel grateful and dependent on them. It is never perfect, it is always more than you deserve and not the way you want it. The feelings of class and racial guilt are challenged by their feelings of vulnerability, as I describe elsewhere in the book. Two contradictory profiles emerge of their house staff, deceitful, but also victims in need of saving and financial assistance, right? We have so much, they have so little. Where is my change? Is he too lazy? Is she secretly wearing my hat when I'm not home? Right? Various strategies are employed to reframe and deflect and absolve the discomfort that comes with hiring intimate laborers whose lives can be improved on with the meagerest of wages to do tasks that you normally would do yourself for free. Many aid workers I spoke to were self-reflexive, not only about their relations with domestic staff, but about their role in Senegal and in the development industry more generally. The vast majority entered the industry with a sincere desire to dedicate their effort and energy to making the world more equitable. After years in the development industry, however, they had a more modest understanding about their potential to make an impact on the persistent structures of inequity that shape the possibilities for sustainable change. The global status quo was stubborn and reinforced at every turn. Poor countries weren't really going to pull themselves out of poverty. They felt the disconnect between their daily paper pushing of the boulder up the hill and the acute and seemingly cemented need all around them. Just as doing one's own laundry does nothing to reverse colonial power relations, pushing back at the development industry's framing and limitations is unlikely to right a very large ship that is carried by the currents of neoliberal capital and a long history of global white supremacy. Besides, the laundry needs doing. Not taking a larger salary than local hires, not living in comfortable housing paid for the dollars earmarked for poverty reduction, not taking advantage of the market rates for care work wouldn't change the global power geometry, would it?
Thank you so much, Dinah. That was wonderful. Really, really interesting. So we're going to move on now to the questions. Peter, you're going to have to direct me. Is it first in the room and then online? Yeah. So it's going to be an alternate. Okay. So, okay, because I've also got questions. So, yes. Please do, please do.
So thank you, Dr. Hannaford, for your presentation, for sharing your work with us. It was really interesting. My mind, what is striking is how the reasons and justifications mentioned by the employers are eventually very similar to the paternalism that we have observed in slavery societies and after in slavery.
Slavery, okay.
Societies, and after in post-slavery societies of Americas. And in fact, this paternalism was a key element in the social control process and the ability of the system to be maintained by itself. But beyond this paternalism, this paternalism was based on racial theory. And I would like to know if you, from your work, what do you think about this articulation between paternalism and racial theory? Do you find this articulation in your work, and what do you think about it?
Should I answer each question?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, no, that parallel is very clear and alive to me as well. And is alive to many of the aid workers themselves. You know, especially American aid workers felt deeply, deeply uncomfortable about having Black people doing domestic service in their home because of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and all this kind of the optics for them were deeply uncomfortable. And again, they employed a lot of these strategies to manage that discomfort because it was very uncomfortable. It rarely was to the benefit of the domestic workers, the strategies they employed, I mean, fundamentally. But certainly, I mean, I think one of the things that I try to do in the book is highlight the fact that the development industry itself is based on racial theory. I mean, is very much, you know, a racialized project that has its foundations in colonial ideas of civility and primitivity, that there's a ladder to modernity that, you know, Western countries are on the top of, and that, you know, everyone else is climbing, right? So it's all, every aspect of it to me involves race. And again, what I've highlighted of it today is that these are not buffoons, right, who are doing aid work. These are, you know, politically left of center, moderate liberals that are well-educated. You know, there are counterparts in many ways, you know, well-educated people who have entered this industry instead of business or other kinds of things with a sincere desire to change and to reduce inequities. And yet they find themselves in this system, which is very hard to fight back from the inside. And they feel very discouraged about it and also profit from it at the same time. So it's this tricky situation. I may sound a little bit, it's hard when I do the voices of the people that I've interviewed. I don't mean to disparage them. You know, I have a lot of, you know, as we were talking about, who among us has not tried to solve the problem of the fact that we live in states that don't provide for caring labor, right? That don't subsidize caring labor, and we live in work cultures that pretend that caring labor doesn't exist, right? We're all kind of stuck in systems of inequity and you know, capitalist unfeelingness and we try to do our best within them, and we often find ourselves paradoxically in positions that we would abhor in others, right? So I thought that was often what I would find with people. Even these strategies on the face, you know, as people were telling me, they weren't like, here's this handy strategy I use to not feel discomfort, but I classify them this way, but they were just telling me I'm not a bad person, right? In all these different kinds of ways they were trying to express to me when this subject came up, that they were not bad.
Okay, thank you, Dinah. I have to then take one on okay, so it's all ours, is it?
Yeah.
Okay, Armina.
Thank you. Thanks, Dinah, for your presentation. So I have 3 interconnected questions. First is, you know, does this discourse about, you know, their guilt, or, you know, how they feel about paying, you know, the domestic workers, also extend to their justifying the disparity of wages with local colleagues? So that's one. Number 2, do, you know, the higher echelons of NGO workers, local NGO workers, like let's say, and local NGO director, do they hire domestic workers?
You mean the like local
Like a Senegalese NGO, you know, and what's the dynamic there?
Sure.
And third, you know, I mean, I've done research on NGOs in Armenia, and I'm somewhat familiar, not entirely, but I know that these would be coveted jobs, like people would want these jobs, right? Because it would be something desirable to have this. So I'm just, from the perspective of the workers themselves. And my last point is, when and I hear this, it seems like they don't recognize their own agency. Like, why cannot they, why is the choice giving handouts or doing a specific project? Why can they not pay decent wages?
That's a great question.
So those are just my questions.
Thank you. These were all great questions because they allow me to talk about some things that are in the book that I haven't been able to talk about today. So thank you so much. Yes, the wage disparity. So, I mean, this is something that comes up a lot. I think there's the way that most of these NGOs are structured and these government aid agencies, the qualifications to reach higher levels of employment just happen, right? To be qualifications that are out of reach for local people, right? You have to have lots of international experience. Good luck if you have a passport that doesn't give you access to working internationally all over the world, right? You have to have this kind of level of education. Again, good luck if you can't get a student visa to one of these countries, right? So there are all these ways in which they have qualifications that are on paper, right, that entitle them to these different positions where local knowledge and familiarity with the local government and connections with local, all those things are disparaged since institutionally. These things that are very important for doing aid work are institutionally not given value, so that these, even though they are what make these machines run, right, they're seen as low skilled kind of positions. So institutionally, they are rewarded for, and many of these people again have gotten the LSE degree, right? Or the degree at, whatever, Georgetown, that entitles them to these positions, and that is reinforced at every turn that you got this degree because you have these specific qualifications, not because of your geographic accident of your birth, right? And so the wages go along with these kinds of positions and qualifications. And which is not to say that these are all robots who don't realize, I mean, I think they do realize that, and it is uncomfortable. But again, they're only in these posts for a few years at a time. And often their most intimate relationships with local people are the domestic workers that they hire, right? This is a rotating door. Local employees of aid agencies don't become personally close to a lot of the expats that are just going to leave after 3 years, right? And so there isn't a lot of room for transparent discussions about those inequities with their colleagues.
Okay.
Also in places like Senegal, if they've been trained in languages, it's usually French, whereas all the local workers are speaking Wolof, right? So there isn't even the opportunity to eavesdrop on a discussion between colleagues, like among your local colleagues about the disparities and things like that. So yeah, but they're not, but okay, let me move really quickly. So yes, local people hire domestic workers. It's very normal for a Senegalese middle-class family to have these things as well. Even a kind of lower-class family in Dakar would probably have someone do the laundry. They would pay for a laundress. And certainly these are coveted jobs. And a lot of the domestic workers I talked to, again, half the study is talking to domestic workers about these jobs. They were thrilled to have these jobs because they paid more than local families. The treatment was much better. The hours were better, right? The perks were good, right? So they themselves counted themselves lucky to work for non-local families. That said, they didn't care if the boss was nice or not, right? And all the things that the employers were doing to bend over backwards and be friendly and things like that were not the things that the domestic workers cared about, right? They cared about wages and they cared about hours. And they cared about, oh, this US family has a washing machine. I don't have to wash the laundry by hand. This is the best job I've ever had, right? These were the kinds of things that made those coveted jobs. And there's a lot of, your last question about the, why can't they just pay more? There's a lot of social pressure not to.
Okay, that's what I assume.
Inflate the market, right? For domestic employers, it's seen as, I mean, I think really it's about lack of solidarity with other expats, right? But it's framed as like, then you'll leave and they'll be used to a style of life that, I mean, again, this logic that filters through development projects as well in ways that are, sus, as the children would say. But yeah, so there's pressure. When Alma, the colleague who is from Latin America, she was saying that she overheard a conversation with her expat staff at this big religious organization, the new person said, oh, by the way, I'm getting a nanny. What do you pay your nanny? And people were outraged to hear who was overpaying, right? The outrage was not for the person who was paying very, very little, but the person who was paying way too much. And she, she was like, I was shocked to hear this. We make good wages like we should, but that is, right? So there's that kind of, and again, there's this dual feeling of vulnerability that to have a lot in a context where no one has a lot makes you feel very vulnerable, right? So the aid workers constantly were talking about being afraid of being taken advantage of. She made me pay 10 cents more for this piece of fabric, or, that taxi driver, I really bargained him down. It was a kind of, you're seen as a dupe or a tourist, right? And so there are ways in which to prove your local bona fides was to pay local rates.
Okay. Thank you. Can I just come into this and just a little bit of, can I just add something, because I'm also looking at this. Dinah, is it really that this market is seen as much more, because I think it's, firstly, at least I'm talking about India, domestic service, whether it's for expats or Indians, is terribly stigmatized. So I'm not sure, is a stigmatized labor. Second, I think there's only a certain niche that wants to work for expats. There's so much there's so much heterogeneity. If you don't have those skill sets and you're not used to those ways, you will not be looking for thinking, wow, I'm going to work for an expat, because those skill sets of Western domestic practices are really necessary. So I'm just wondering whether, we need to sort of not hype that up too much, that that everybody wants to work for expats, everybody wants, the wages are better. Actually, there are two different models here. And they're different markets here. But I'd leave you to.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I think in the Senegalese case, there's much more. It's very likely that domestic workers for expats has been domestic workers for Senegalese families. That's very common.
Is it stigmatized?
It's not stigmatized in the same way it would be in India.
Okay.
It tends to be rural migrant women who do it because the wages are very low. But not because it's a stigmatized form of labor. And though there are caste systems in the various Senegalese ethnicities, it doesn't enter into domestic service.
I think that's a very big difference.
It's a very big difference. And I would say too that of course there are these kind of specialized skills. So one of the chapters, I looked through all the advertisements, they're classified ads for domestic workers that employers make for their domestic workers when they leave the country, right? So like, take Marie, she's fabulous, take my nanny, please. But they list all these specialized skills. Makes a great banana bread, or skill sets. Yeah, skill sets. Like she knows how to give your son flashcards for math problems, right? These kinds of things that they both learn on the job. And so having an experienced domestic worker who has worked for families is something that's really advertised. She's worked before with a Dutch family and a Finnish family. Like, I really recommend her, right? She's that kind of specialist. But I knew lots and lots of domestic workers who had started as domestic workers in Senegalese families and then moved on and to what is considered a higher, a better position.
Right.
And I'm not sure that after working, these families leave all the time. So they're often they're chronically out of work, but they're usually trying to get to another expat family.
Okay, so loads of questions coming up. I saw Anandita's hand first, and ask, because if there's related questions, we'll put it together. So do ask.
Thanks I'm sorry I came a little late, but thank you so much for this. I just wanted to connect it again, following up with Shalini, with the larger theoretical framework, which is used, for instance, in case of transnational surrogacy, where there is a lot of conversation about philanthropy and about philanthrocapitalism. And I wonder at one level, is there a conversation amongst the expats in comparing themselves to local clientele as better? I think somebody already asked this, but I just wanted to position it within that discourse and ask, do they think that, we are treating the help better than the locals are. And are there middlemen or those who supply workers who also position that kind of, that work as philanthropy for expats who are?
Great question.
Thank you.
Is there anyone whose question connects with Anandita? No? Okay.
So there are some agencies that place people, but they're very rarely used by expats in Dakar. In fact, people warn you to stay away from them on message boards about, I just came to Dakar, they say that they're kind of fraudulent and they're run by men and who inflate the CVs of these domestic workers artificially, right? So it's actually really direct. And what there is a network between expats to connect. Oh, well, my nanny's sister is also a nanny, you should hire her. And this kind of more informal marketplace among expats of, oh, I was in Dakar 7 years ago, you should try to find and hire my housekeeper, she's great. Or we had a chauffeur, but we don't use him anymore. Does anyone need a chauffeur because he's still looking for work? These kinds of informal networks are how people are hired, not through middlemen, which is very different, I think, in Dakar than it is in lots of other countries where these same aid workers were posted. A lot of them, especially in Asia, used middlemen in the Middle East too. I think there were lots of, obviously, about the Middle East and these kind of headhunting organizations. I love that you're connecting to the surrogacy. Yeah, there's so many overlaps in the philanthropocapitalism. Certainly the aid workers, part of your question too about why don't they just pay more, is they think of their wages relative, not to their own wages that they're earning, but relative to what their domestic worker would earn for a local family. And certainly it's much, much higher. And they would tell me all the time, again, the nosy anthropologist, about horror stories about what their maids had suffered in others, even with other expats. She worked for a French lady who never gave her Sundays off, or, to position themselves comparatively with other people in a favorable and cool, chill boss, friendly person kind of way all the time. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Ruchika, Fabrizio, and oh gosh, okay. Sorry, this is really nice. Ruchika, I think she was okay. Ruchika, how are you? Come.
Yeah, my name is Riyao. I'm studying MA Gender Studies in USOS, and I'm also planning to do the similar topic for my dissertation. So I have a question regarding to does the fact of hiring a domestic worker in a house kind of have any impact in the gender dynamic within the family, like between family members? So the context I'm asking is because I've been looking at researchers in the East Asia region, after hiring domestic workers, the lady would say, oh, it is actually kind of liberation for me because otherwise she will be doing most of the work. So I want to know about this.
Yeah, what a great question.
Any connected question to hers? There's no connected question. Go ahead.
So yeah, it's a great question. I could talk to you for 4 hours about it. But one of the things that I would say is that, yes, very much a similar dynamic in that that aid workers that I talked about work-life balance and their ability to lean in at work, or to in a way that they could never have fathomed doing at home, right? So families told me stories, women would tell me stories about how they just couldn't make family and work at home in Europe or the United States, that especially the United States where there's no social services practically, and where these women often worked in places like Washington, DC, where it's $2,000 a month for daycare, just obscene. And so then they came abroad, and one woman was telling me how she would leave work, get on the metro, get on the, the underground basically. And her husband would hand her the baby as he went off to work, and she would take the baby on the metro and take it home and strap the baby to her back and start doing cooking. And then they got to their first post, which I think was Tanzania, and they hired a maid and a nanny and a chauffeur and a gardener. And then all of a sudden at night, they were like, oh, who are you, to each other, right? They could spend time together for the first time in their whole marriage, and it brought them closer together as a couple. And women especially talked about this elevation in their quality of life because they weren't responsible for domestic work at home. They came home after long days at work to the clean house, dinner ready and on the table, children bathed and ready for bed. I mean, it was just a really a huge removal of the second shift for these women, and that allowed them to climb the corporate, these NGO ladders of work. Can be a very intensive work environment to work in development, and so they were able to make advances more rapidly than they would have at home for certain. Yeah.
Sort of one quick follow-up,
Yeah.
does the husband know, aware this kind of change is happening?
Yeah, I mean, it was funny too, because a lot of these women had husbands who were trailing spouses, who didn't have formal work. But it was never a thought that then they would do the domestic work, almost never, right?
Were they entering the kitchen anymore?
Yes, and the kind of, I mean, it's a good question. No, I think there was, yeah, certainly, and there was lots of performative domestic work done. But often, and especially a lot of these couples were Western women and men that they had met somewhere in their, so a lot had African husbands too, and this kind of displaced some of the anxiety that living back in the West in their pairing when the woman is the main wage earner and the husband isn't. The fact that domestic labor is outsourced actually made for more spousal harmony than there would be in the case where, like, well, you're the one home, you're going to have to cook and do the laundry, right? So yeah, it's a great question.
Okay, wonderful. Ruchi, I'll get back to you. Ruchi is a historian, so I think her question.
Yeah, I think somewhat you're right. Thank you so much for the thought-provoking sort of a talk. What I was thinking is that, when we talk about the idea of domestic sort of service, there is a kind of hierarchy. If the aid workers would have, the local people working for them in the official spaces, would they still feel that awkwardness for employing them in the official spaces as they feel when they employ these local people in the domestic spaces? I often find in very progressive spaces, this hierarchically, I mean, it's very gendered for me. And as an Indian, very caste-based. If you're working in a home, you must be more disadvantaged, more sort of marginalized than somebody, and more needy than somebody who's working. Because, in a official space, because the aid workers in the official space must be all obviously hiring the non-domestic workers. But this kind of, so is it a hierarchy? Or is it sort of a white guilt? Because the domestic work is also sort of a memory of slavery for them. So is there I'm noticing a dichotomy in this that they would not have felt in the labor that they would have used, or is it gender? Because
so are you saying when they're hiring like development workers, local people to work as development
to
workers?
work in the non-domestic spaces, is there a hierarchy in non-domestic labor that they are hiring and a domestic service that they're? I'm sort of seeing that labor and service as hierarchical in our opinion as well.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that there are hierarchies within work organizations that are already in place, right? And they certainly come and enter them and don't subvert them, right? They're very much conforming to the hierarchies that already exist in these spaces. Yeah.
So, but is the guilt, you mentioned that there's a guilt in sort of hiring the domestic labor. Would they have the same guilt in employing?
Less so, I think, because it seems less personal. I think, just that the intimate space of the home, there's no other boss, right? Whereas I think when they're in workplace structures, even when they're directors of the country office, they're not really the boss. And so I think let me think. It's an interesting question. I don't think there's guilt. I think again, there's concern about inequality, but I don't think it usually gets personalized in the same way that it does when it's in the domestic space.
I mean, in India, I've come across expats who completely deny they have domestic help when they do. They're actually just too embarrassed. It's denied, they've invisibilized them. They're just.
We see that in lots of cases. I mean, domestic work is, because it's located at home, it's private, it's really something that isn't discussed very much, which is again why I wanted to write a whole book about it, is that making it invisible obviously makes people more vulnerable to it. And I think that there's a real need to pull it, under the analytical light for that reason.
Thank you. So I've got two more questions here, Fabricio, and then you. Fabricio, you had a question, right?
Yes, all these questions, and especially Miles' question and your talk, resonate a lot with my experience in the global South. I'm from the largest country, the global South, outside the Euro-Asian space, where slavery, aside for the Roman Catholic Church, slavery was the only nationwide institution for more than 400 years. And we still see this how this resonates nowadays in the structure, in this relationship with bosses and domestic workers. In the context that it's very common still to see in, say, new building development for upper middle class. It's not unusual to see like there is like a maid,
Yeah.
a bed, room for them. At the same time, there is also this idea for some of the bosses, some of the employers to say they hire, well, in some cases the woman would try, the employers, like the female employers would say that they want to prosper in their careers, as someone else mentioned. And they want to say restructure their gender roles in the household, but instead of like having a more balanced division of the labor inside with the husband, eventually the children, you outsource the work
To another woman, right?
to another woman, usually like for woman. But it's not unusual to see among the male employers a discourse that she has to do that as a way to say, challenge patriarchy or something like that, because that's the only way for her to break the chains that keeps her locked in the household. If you have to outsource this hiring for Black woman, that's just a side effect. So there's this, so let's call this feminist approach to their own, but not to the ones they are employing.
Sure.
And this seems to be very common in every society where there's this huge wealth or wage gaps. In Brazil, it's because of the legacy. In this country, like the foreign workers who came to work in the aid industry, they are become at least socioeconomically the upper classes in a sense.
Sure.
How do they, or especially for the female employers, how do they understand this from this perspective of changing gender roles? Because it's changing in other contexts, change only for the employers, not for the employees. At least that's how they would have rationalized it. I would like to hear more about how in this context they think
Yeah, well, it fits really well with what I said kind of about the about their becoming mentors and giving advice, right? Several women talked about their domestic employees as having, as being career women also, right? That they care about their career too, which I'm going to help them with their career. I'll pay for them to get English classes so that they can, be more, desirable domestic workers for, right? So they see solidarity in kind of providing career opportunities for the career woman that, their career just happens to be taking care of my children, right? But so that is one way that gets rationalized. It is really interesting how little I asked every domestic worker I talked to, what does your employer do? Like what kinds of projects do they do? And none of them had any idea. They had never spoken to a single one of their bosses about their development work. And partly there's a socialized thing about not being curious, being like what some of these women are not supposed to ask questions or be curious, but partly it was because they saw it as so wholly unconnected to their lives. Right. And when I asked aid workers, do you ever ask the local person who lives in your home questions about Senegalese culture or things like that would help you in your work? It had never occurred to them, right, that they have a local person at home who they could find out local information. It was interesting to me how separate in their minds these spheres were. And I mean, I think partly that points to the fact that a lot of international development, the specialized work that they got degrees here at the LSE for doesn't have anything to do with local culture, right? And having access to information about the local area is something that local workers do, right? So it's, again, not considered high class or important. They know how to balance a US government budget, right? Or like whatever it is that there are technical skills that are technicized, to be specialists that can work in Botswana as well as Brazil, right? But those sectors never cross, right? So even if they were there doing women's empowerment or some kind of gender and development thing, which is very often, that's very popular still in development work. They never really saw those as relevant to their relations with their domestic employees. Isn't that interesting? I think it's, they almost never connected those dots.
Wonderful. And you've got one more question. Yeah,
thank you.
there's
So-
one after you. Go ahead, you go ahead.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So my day job's at Oxfam when I'm not a visiting
Oh,
fellow.
wonderful.
It's super tiny.
Such work.
I've already texted notes. And it's really timely because I think in our latest update to staff policies, we're paying attention to how staff behave vis-a-vis.
Oh, I'd love to consult, just.
Yeah, it's an internal document. No. So two questions. I think early on in your presentation you talked about the sort of the aid sector perhaps being different or, sort of exceptionalism, given that this is a sector there to help. Is there empirical difference that suggests that aid workers behave differently as expats? Okay, just wanted to check on that. And then the other thing.
No, you're saying, is there empirical evidence that they do behave differently than people who are there for diplomacy or business? I mean, it's very mixed. No, I wouldn't say that there's.
Yeah, because I'd be curious about the hypothesis, because I wonder whether, is it about class and lived experience more than, say, the sector that you might be serving in your expatriate portfolio? So it's just, I wanted to test the sort of like exceptionalism question. And then the other one was around the sort of, you talked about, I think most of your interviewees were from America and Europe.
Well, of the expatriate workers, yeah. Well, also, no, not exclusively, but yeah, but primarily, yes.
Because there's certainly, I'm also curious about whether there's work being done on the non-white expats who are in these contexts, because certainly, I'm trying to look while you're talking, I don't think there's a single Oxfam country director in Africa who's white any longer. So they're all either from country, from region, or increasingly professional South Asian workers, who in my experience, I think as several people have said, have no qualms whatsoever about work because they come from families or backgrounds in their South Asian home countries. That would do it. So it just sounds like that's your next book.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, no.
No, it's not connected. Okay.
It's a great question. I think what I was trying to say, and I'm sure I didn't articulate it well, is that not that there was an exceptional way that aid workers acted, but that they felt an exceptional discomfort with the purpose of their experience and like the purpose of their position in Africa and their privilege, right? So not that they acted much differently than other expatriates, or that their behavior was better or anything like that, or that they moved through spaces with more humility or anything like that, just that they had more psychological discomfort, I think, with reckoning their vocation with their position socially. And yes, okay, and so thank you for the next bit.
Quickly, just ask. Dinah may not be able to answer, but just ask the question.
I was just wondering, so when male domestic laborers are hired, is there an equation of men being in a conventionally feminized job of domestic labor, and how does that play out in in the whole household and the treatment, and again sort of relating to the gender hierarchy?
So maybe we'll answer that.
Sure.
Because also, as I'm the chair today, I'm just quickly gonna put in my little bit here. I was just wondering, for just comparison, Dinah, in India, expats have a culture, a very punitive culture of blacklisting their domestic workers. And this is part of colonial injustices and colonial legacies. I'm wondering whether that culture of blacklisting is there in Senegal. It leads to suicides, it leads to terrible things. That's why I do not consider this market to be in any way transformatory. The second is the definition of expatriate. In India, it's very much if you're blonde or white. And the third is, were your domestic workers part of wider global care chains? And a historical question, which I think Ruchi will relate to, is something across domestic service everywhere in the world. Do the employers just constantly see this occupation as something very special and different, because it's so much based on gratitude rather than really a proper fair wage. So I will just end there with, we can discuss this later, but let me thank you for an absolutely wonderful afternoon. The questions were great, the discussion was great, so let's give a big